Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're stepping into a moment when the entire American economy came within inches of collapse, and the only thing standing in the way was a single man in a locked room. No election, no law, no vote. Just one financier, aging, private, ruthless, holding the fate of a nation in his hands. His name wasn't on ballots, but it was whispered in every boardroom: J.P. Morgan. Before we dive in, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy stories like this. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always surreal to see these stories reaching people from all over the world. Now, settle in. Maybe dim the lights. Let the rain tap on the window or the fan hum beside you. Because tonight, we're headed to the autumn streets of 1907 New York, where whispers in marble hallways turned into screams in the streets, and the entire system began to crack. In the quiet glow of an autumn morning in New York City, the streets of Lower Manhattan stirred gently to life. The year was 1907. Carriages rolled slowly over cobblestones. Gas lamps flickered as the last mist of dawn lifted over the East River. The towering buildings of Wall Street, temples of money and power, loomed with pride, their stone faces basking in the gold-tinted haze. There was something serene in the air, something deceptively calm, like the final exhale before a storm. This was a city ruled not by kings or presidents, but by capital. Steel, copper, coal, and railroads were its soldiers. Stock tickers, its language, and finance, its throne. America was in the midst of an age of empire, not one built with colonies abroad, but with corporations at home. And at the heart of it all was trust. Trust in money, trust in markets, trust in the men who ran them. But trust, like glass, could shatter in silence. And in 1907, though the skies were clear, the floor beneath Wall Street was beginning to tremble. The early 20th century in America was a paradox, a glittering age with a cracking core. The nation was industrializing at lightning speed. Railroads stitched the continent together. Smokestacks rose in cities like Pittsburgh and Detroit. Oil flowed from Pennsylvania, steel poured from furnaces, and capital soared through the veins of New York's financial institutions. On the surface, prosperity reigned. The New York Stock Exchange had been climbing for years. Dozens of new investment trusts, lightly regulated financial entities, sprang up like ivy across Wall Street. People were buying more shares than ever before, often with money they didn't have. Margin buying was common. Investors would borrow large amounts to buy stocks, gambling on the hope that prices would keep rising. Banks, sensing profit, fed this frenzy. In public lobbies, stock tickers printed out a never-ending stream of numbers, flickering symbols of wealth and optimism. Bankers walked with straight backs and gold watches. Newspapers cheered on the economy like a prizefighter. But behind the thick marble walls of the financial world, there was something more fragile than many dared admit: overconfidence. Even before October, signs of weakness had begun to show. Railroad profits were falling. Agriculture yields in parts of the Midwest were poor. The cost of living was rising faster than wages for the working class. Yet Wall Street, obsessed with speculation, paid little attention. More dangerously, many banks and investment trusts were tied together in a web of unregulated credit. The lines between personal ambition and institutional security had blurred. In these vaults of empire, money changed hands quickly, but risk changed hands even faster. One particularly dangerous figure in this growing instability was a man named F. Augustus Heinze, a Montana copper baron who had made a fortune manipulating mining stocks and bank loans in the West. In 1907, Heinze arrived in New York with the confidence of a gambler and the swagger of a self-made tycoon. He wanted more than just wealth. He wanted to conquer Wall Street, and he would try to do it by cornering one of the most volatile markets of all: copper. Heinz's plan, though bold, was not new. He wanted to corner the market, a strategy where one buys up the entire supply of a commodity, driving the price sky high, then forcing short sellers to buy back at inflated prices. His target, the United Copper Company. In early October, Heinz believed he could manipulate the stock price and trap other traders who had bet against it. The first phase of the plan worked. Shares of United Copper surged, rumors flew through the streets. Heinz looked like a genius, but the illusion was brief. The traders Heinz had targeted were not trapped as he thought. Instead, they refused to cover their shorts. The price collapsed overnight. United Copper shares fell from $62 to $15 in just 2 days. Millions were lost. Heinz's empire, built more on confidence than capital, began to crumble. But it wasn't just his personal fortune at stake. Heinz was closely tied to Mercantile National Bank, Butte Savings Bank, and several other trust companies. His fall sent tremors through the entire financial system. To understand what happened next, we must understand what trust companies were. Unlike national banks, which were subject to strict regulations, trust companies operated in a much looser legal space. They managed estates, handled investments, and most importantly, held deposits. But they were not required to keep the same levels of liquid cash on hand. Their profits were higher, their risks greater. By 1907, trust companies had become deeply integrated into the U.S. financial system. Many people believed they were as safe as banks, but they weren't. And when confidence in one trust company fell, the entire sector could collapse like dominoes. That's exactly what happened next. The Knickerbocker Trust Company was one of the largest and most respected institutions of its kind. Its president, Charles T. Barney, had close ties with Heinz and other speculative figures. When news of Heinz's failure hit the streets, depositors grew uneasy. Then, someone whispered a rumor. That was all it took. On October 21st, a crowd formed outside Knickerbocker's main office. Within hours, lines snaked around the building. People, ordinary people, were terrified their money was gone. They pounded the doors, shouted at tellers, demanded to withdraw their savings. A bank run had begun. And the most terrifying part? Knickerbocker didn't have enough cash on hand to meet the demand. No trust company did. That was never the plan, as long as people trusted them. But trust was dead. By the next day, Knickerbocker Trust was forced to close its doors. The shockwaves rippled instantly through the financial system. Other banks, fearing the same fate, began hoarding cash. Call loans, short-term credit extended to stockbrokers, were pulled. Stock prices plummeted. The New York Stock Exchange was teetering. What happened next was unlike anything seen in New York in decades. People began pulling money from every institution they could. The National Bank of Commerce, Trust Company of America, and Lincoln Trust all saw enormous withdrawals. The U.S. Treasury, realizing the threat, quickly deposited federal funds into major banks to stabilize them. But it wasn't enough. There was no central bank to act as a lender of last resort, no Federal Reserve, no government safety net. Only private capital stood between the nation and collapse. And one man, above all, had the means and the will to stop it. But he had not yet entered the scene. In a quiet mansion just off Madison Avenue, behind thick drapes and wood-paneled walls, John Pierpont Morgan sat in silence. He was not yet acting, not yet intervening, but he was watching, studying, measuring. He had done this before. During the Panic of 1895, when he had single-handedly rescued the US Treasury from bankruptcy by arranging a massive gold loan. He knew what panic looked like. He knew the scent of fear in a banker's voice. And he knew that once trust was broken, the world turned upside down. But Morgan was not a savior. He was not a philanthropist. He was a financier, cold, calculating, and methodical. He did not move until the moment was right. And now, that moment was fast approaching. Wall Street was no longer humming. It was trembling. The gears of American capitalism, so confident, so proud, were grinding to a halt. Crowds gathered outside banks in hushed dread. Businesses paused. Trains stopped. Even the great stock exchange was considering shutting down. A whisper in the vault had become a scream in the streets. And in the shadows of his study, with a ledger in one hand and the nation's fate in the other, the most powerful man in America was about to step forward. But first, the storm would deepen. On the morning of October 22, 1907, the doors of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, once seen as a fortress of stability, remained shut. Cold iron gates, once polished with pride, were now the boundary between panic and protocol. A handwritten notice, pinned hastily to the doors, read, "Closed, pending arrangements." For hundreds gathered outside in the chill of morning, it may as well have said, "Hope denied." The second largest trust company in New York had collapsed. But it wasn't just the fall of a bank. It was the fall of belief. Word spread quickly. Clerks shouted the news across trading floors. Messengers ran from building to building. 1,000 whispers became a single roar. Knickerbocker has failed. By 10 a.m., a second run had begun, this time at the Trust Company of America. Hundreds lined up at its Broadway location. Some clutched savings books. Others pressed their faces to the glass, peering inside as if they might glimpse the truth. Was their money still safe? Tellers inside counted notes with shaking hands. Ledgers slammed shut. Executives gathered behind closed doors. Calls were made. But the tide was already rushing in. The Trust Company of America was a larger institution than Knickerbocker, and arguably more solvent. But that didn't matter. In a panic, facts fall silent. Fear becomes contagious. Every trust company became suspect. Lines formed at Lincoln Trust, Colonial Trust, Fidelity Trust, and dozens more. Police were deployed to control the crowds. Some people wept, others shouted. Most simply stood, cold and motionless, waiting for their chance to withdraw what little they had. Inside boardrooms, presidents and treasurers scrambled. Could they get emergency funds? Could they sell securities fast enough to raise cash? But the banks weren't the only ones trembling. So were the stockbrokers, men who lived and died by margin loans. The New York Stock Exchange, barely a block away from the rising tide of bank runs, had become a pressure chamber. Brokers stormed in before the opening bell. Phones rang in sharp bursts. Clerks spilled coffee onto order slips. There was no time for small talk. The trading bell rang at 10 o'clock a.m., and within seconds, prices began to fall. Steel, Union Pacific, American Smelting. The titans were tumbling. Even blue-chip stocks were sinking. Margin calls echoed down every telephone wire in the district. Brokers called in debts, forcing liquidations. The more stocks were sold, the further prices dropped, triggering more panic. A vicious, unrelenting cycle. The volume of trading on October 22nd was the largest in years. And yet, this was only the beginning. While brokers and bank presidents fought to hold the system together, one man sat alone, utterly defeated. Charles T. Barney, the ousted head of Knickerbocker Trust, was holed up in his mansion on East 38th Street. Once the toast of Manhattan's upper crust, Barney had become the face of a national collapse overnight. He wasn't a crook. He wasn't even reckless by the standards of the day, but he had ties to speculators, to Heinze and Morse, and in the fog of fear, that was all it took. Barney made one final attempt to restore his reputation. He wrote a letter to friends, explaining that his decisions were made in good faith, but it didn't matter. Weeks later, in early November, he would place a revolver to his temple and end his life. It's difficult to grasp today the sheer absence of structure in the American financial system in 1907. There was no Federal Reserve, no guarantee of deposits, no coordinated way to inject emergency funds. The U.S. Treasury could move money into the markets, and it did, but its efforts were limited and politically risky. Secretary of the Treasury George B. Cortelyou approved a $25 million infusion into the banking system, but it was like tossing water on a wildfire. There was only one true source of emergency capital in the country, and it didn't belong to the government. It belonged to a man. By October 24th, panic had spread beyond New York. Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Cleveland all experienced smaller but similar bank runs. Factories began laying off workers. Construction halted. Store owners turned away credit customers. Farmers couldn't get loans for spring planting. Entire communities felt the breath of a storm that had begun with copper shares in a Manhattan boardroom. It wasn't just a crisis of money anymore. It was a crisis of faith in the system, in the institutions, and in the men who ran them. As the Trust Company of America began hemorrhaging cash, its board made a desperate call to the one man they knew might help: J.P. Morgan. They begged for assistance. They needed millions immediately, or they too would fall. Morgan listened. He said little. He nodded, then excused himself to walk the perimeter of the building. He spoke to tellers, watched the lines of depositors, examined the vaults. He didn't speak for over an hour. Then he returned to his library. He summoned New York's top bankers and brokers, and with the calm of a general before battle, he said, "We must act, and we must act tonight." That evening, inside Morgan's massive private library at 36th Street and Madison Avenue, the titans of finance assembled. The room was heavy with silence and cigar smoke. Books rose in mahogany shelves from floor to ceiling. Lamplight flickered against dark oak paneling. Portraits of Morgan's ancestors, stern men of banking and empire, looked down like ghosts. Morgan stood at the head of the long table, his massive frame motionless, his hands clasped. His eyes, sharp and cold beneath his heavy brows, scanned the room. "If we do not support this institution," he said slowly, "others will fail, and if they fail, we will fall." No one interrupted. This was not a man who made requests. This was a man who declared reality. And yet, even as plans were being drawn to save the Trust Company of America, Morgan knew this was just the first wall to hold. Others would come. The entire financial system was a levee, cracked, soaked, and buckling. On October 25, 1907, thanks to a late-night infusion coordinated by Morgan and his syndicate of bankers, the Trust Company of America reopened its doors. Deposit lines were still long, but less frantic. Clergy were asked to preach calm from their pulpits. Newspapers published editorials urging courage. Slowly, and only slightly, the bleeding stopped. But not everywhere. The panic had taken a life of its own. Runs continued sporadically across the country. Brokers still liquidated stocks. Smaller banks collapsed in silence. Morgan had bought time, not peace. Despite the temporary reprieve, two existential threats remained. First, the New York Stock Exchange was facing a liquidity crisis. If call money ran dry, trading would be suspended. Second, the Clearinghouse Association, The body responsible for settling interbank transactions was considering a halt. If either went down, the entire economy might freeze. And so, as October waned, the fate of the American financial system was now in the hands of a private citizen, one man acting in the void where government dared not tread. By the end of the month, whispers of Morgan's leadership reached the White House. President Roosevelt, often a critic of financiers, watched cautiously from afar. He knew Morgan had power, but he also knew Morgan was no Democrat. He answered to no electorate, no law, no oversight. Yet at that moment, he was the system. Outside Wall Street, Americans waited. They read papers in coffee shops, held their breath at teller windows, and whispered prayers over kitchen tables. Would their bank open tomorrow? Would they still have a job? Would their child's college savings vanish into the storm? Narration slows. Quiet piano notes, gentle snowfall imagery. Wall Street did not sleep that autumn. The men who moved the levers of money paced behind locked doors. Some gambled, some prayed, some broke under the weight. But one man, stern, aging, unsmiling, now held the levers alone. And in the hush between chaos and collapse, J.P. Morgan stepped fully into the light. Not as a savior, but as the last remaining pillar. The room was unusually quiet for Manhattan. Thick velvet curtains blocked the late October light. Gas lamps hissed softly, their flames dancing behind smoked glass. And at the far end of the room, beneath the gaze of dusty oil portraits and iron chandeliers, stood a man with silver hair, arched eyebrows, and a face carved from stone. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, but to most in the room, he was simply the banker. He did not smile. He did not need to. Because in 1907, when the American economy began to spiral into panic and ruin, J.P. Morgan did what the president could not, what Congress dared not, and what the markets had failed to do. He stopped the fall. But it did not begin with action. It began with silence and the slow turning of pages. Morgan's personal library at 36th Street and Madison Avenue was no ordinary place. To those who entered, it felt more like a fortress than a study, lined with Renaissance paintings, medieval manuscripts, and the rarest collection of books in the country. But in the final days of October 1907, it transformed into something far more urgent, the unofficial war room of American capitalism. There were no journalists allowed inside, no photographs taken, only voices, paper, calculations, and decisions that would shape the fate of millions. Here, Morgan would gather the city's top bankers, trust company presidents, and brokers. Names like James Stillman, George Baker, and Benjamin Strong sat hunched over tables, brows furrowed, hands shaking slightly. They had built empires. Now they feared watching them fall, and every eye eventually turned toward the thick, motionless figure at the head of the room. Morgan sat, ledger open, thumb on the edge of a page. A single gas lamp illuminated the veins in his temple. He spoke slowly, calculatedly. "This institution must not be allowed to fail," he said, regarding the Trust Company of America. There were murmurs, questions, excuses. He raised his voice only once that night, a deep growl, more vibration than sound. "You will subscribe." And they did. Morgan's approach to the crisis was surgical. He didn't believe in charity. He believed in triage, the practice of assessing which institutions could be saved and which should be allowed to die. His criteria were simple. If a trust company was fundamentally sound, he would back it. If it was speculative, dishonest, or fatally overexposed, he would let it collapse. He personally reviewed the balance sheets of each institution under threat. No assistant, No committee. Just Morgan, a pencil, and a mind sharpened by decades of high-stakes finance. Executives were made to wait in adjacent rooms, sweating through their collars, pacing by the hour until they were summoned for his verdict. And it was always brief. Support him. He goes. You'll have my answer tomorrow. To some, Morgan seemed cold, imperious, even godlike. But those closest to him knew something deeper was at work. He wasn't playing savior. He was managing collapse. But Morgan, for all his influence, was not invincible. He was 70 years old. He suffered from chronic fatigue, rosacea, insomnia, and piercing headaches that worsened with stress. His nose, disfigured by skin disease, was a subject of mockery in the press, a reminder that even titans could bleed. He lived under the constant weight of scrutiny. He despised reporters, avoided interviews, and loathed cameras. He was called a robber baron by reformers and a necessary evil by moderates. But in the moment of crisis, no one could deny his effectiveness. Each night, he worked into the small hours. Doctors warned him to rest. He refused. He claimed the nation couldn't afford his sleep. His daughter, Anne, described him during these days as a man carrying a burning city on his shoulders, one brick at a time. On Sunday, October 27th, the tension reached a boiling point. The New York Stock Exchange was hours away from closing its doors, not out of caution, but because the call money market had dried up. No one was lending. Brokers could not meet margin calls. A complete market freeze was imminent. Morgan summoned representatives of the city's largest trust companies to his library. They arrived reluctantly, most hoping others would provide the funds. He greeted them politely, then locked the doors, literally. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will not leave this room until we have a solution." They protested. They sweated. Some cursed. Morgan waited. In the next room, he placed a team of accountants and clerks with books and ledgers. They reviewed every trust company's finances, preparing Morgan's triage list. Hours passed. Then, Morgan re-entered the room and handed the bankers a piece of paper. "These are the contributions each of you will make. Sign." There was silence, but one by one they signed. And the next morning, the exchange opened, barely, with enough liquidity to keep the system alive. While all this unfolded, President Theodore Roosevelt was far from Wall Street, traveling in the American West, delivering speeches on trust busting and national pride. He had little fondness for Morgan. Years earlier, he had pursued antitrust cases against Morgan's Northern Securities Railroad conglomerate. Their correspondence was icy, filled with veiled barbs. Yet in 1907, even Roosevelt recognized the necessity of Morgan's role. "He may not be a saint," Roosevelt confided to a friend, "but he's the only man who can stop the bleeding." Roosevelt quietly endorsed Cortelyou's decision to work with Morgan. He knew the political risk, that critics would call it government by oligarch, but there was no alternative. The US government had built no safety net, so the nation turned to a man whose only authority was trust, the one thing in short supply. By early November, the immediate panic had been contained. Morgan's efforts had stabilized the most critical institutions. Liquidity had returned to key trust companies. The stock exchange survived. Major brokerage firms avoided insolvency, though just barely. Still, the broader economy would take months to recover. Small banks continued to fail in rural areas. Credit remained tight. Businesses delayed investments. Wages were cut. But the core had held. And in the center of it all stood J.P. Morgan, older, grayer, and more solitary than ever. In the weeks following the crisis, public sentiment shifted. Newspapers that once demonized Morgan now printed cautious praise. The Man Who Saved Wall Street read one headline. Others were less generous. Should one man hold so much power? And that question echoed through Congress, universities, labor unions, and churches. How had the fate of an entire economic system fallen into the hands of one individual, a private citizen, unelected and unaccountable? Morgan himself never answered the question. He simply returned to his desk, reviewed his investments, wrote brief, impersonal thank you notes to those who had helped. He gave no speeches. He offered no memoir, because he knew the story was not yet over. The public still didn't understand how close they had come to the edge, how close the American financial heart had come to stopping. In the gilded towers of Wall Street, great men shuffled papers and whispered over ledgers. But beyond the libraries and boardrooms, in the narrow alleys and crowded tenements, on quiet porches and bustling sidewalks, the true face of the panic was revealed. It wasn't made of gold or marble. It was made of people. A grocer staring at empty shelves, a tailor folding unpaid orders, a mother counting coins beside a fireplace gone cold, a young man clutching a telegram that read, "Position suspended, wait for instructions." As the panic of 1907 spread from the banks to the bakeries, from stockbrokers to stable boys, it became not just a financial crisis, it became a human one. By the first days of November 1907, the numbers on the stock ticker no longer felt like mere statistics. They were ghosts of savings, specters of lost dreams. Each percentage point down on the Dow was a cancelled wedding, a pawned heirloom, a job no longer needed. America had no safety net. There was no unemployment insurance, no social security, no minimum wage. If a business closed its doors, its workers were sent home, without severance, without ceremony. In New York alone, over 100,000 people lost their jobs before Christmas. The sounds of the city changed. The constant clatter of horses pulling market carts slowed to a murmur. Delivery boys ran fewer routes. The bells of factories rang less often. Telegraph offices were quieter. Newspapers sold fewer copies. But one sound grew louder: boots in line. At the banks, people queued in silence, wrapped in scarves and dread. At churches, women gathered to pray. At employment offices, men arrived with resumes written by candlelight. "I've worked 15 years," one man told a clerk in Boston, "but I've never begged for a position until today." The panic didn't stop in New York. It moved west, to Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, Cincinnati. Small-town banks, even if they were solvent, faced sudden withdrawals. Depositors didn't care about balance sheets. They cared about trust. And that trust was gone. Farmers couldn't get loans for seed. Hardware stores shut down. Lumberyards fell silent. Railroads cut back routes, leaving rural stations abandoned. In Iowa, a local paper reported, children walk home from school to find fathers sitting on the porch in silence, coats still on. In Georgia, sharecroppers were forced to barter vegetables for tools. In Pennsylvania, a small coal town saw 5 of its 7 mines suspend operations within a week. In city and country alike, the machine had stopped. In households across the country, children noticed changes before they understood them. Fewer lights at night, shorter dinners, parents whispering in corners. Many stopped attending school, not for lack of care, but for need. Boys as young as 10 began selling newspapers. Girls took in sewing. Some stood outside storefronts, offering to carry bags for nickels. Shoes were patched instead of replaced. Ribbons were taken off dresses and sold. Christmas trees stood bare that year, or not at all. One letter from a schoolteacher in Newark, written to a friend in December 1907, read, "They do not speak of it, the little ones, but you can see it in their drawings. Houses without windows, mothers with tears, and skies without sun. Though no riots broke out and the streets did not burn, the panic dug deep into the psyche of the people. There was a sense of quiet betrayal. For years, the newspapers had sung the praises of finance. Banks had promised safety. Politicians had promised prosperity. The stock exchange was treated like a cathedral. And then, it fell. Without warning, without explanation. For the everyday American, this was not just a market correction. It was a breach of faith. Amid the sorrow, signs of resilience emerged. In Brooklyn and the Bronx, churches opened their kitchens. In Chicago, Jewish and Catholic groups organized soup lines for the newly unemployed. In Pittsburgh, steelworkers' wives formed food-sharing networks, each household contributing what little it could. Storekeepers extended credit to neighbors they trusted. Doctors treated without pay. Some landlords deferred rent by handshake. Even among the wreckage, there was kindness, small, flickering acts of hope. But the lines grew longer, and winter was coming. Among the many stories to emerge from the panic was that of Eleanor Ross, a widowed schoolteacher from Springfield, Missouri, who wrote to a local paper in early December. Her letter, later reprinted in several cities, captured the emotional toll better than any headline. "I teach in a one-room schoolhouse. 2 of my older boys no longer attend. They are working now, helping their fathers in the field. One girl, Mary, cried quietly at her desk yesterday. When I asked why, she said she missed her mother's cooking. Her mother has taken work cleaning floors to pay off a loan. I gave Mary half my sandwich today. I don't know if I'll have another tomorrow, but I felt I must. Because this isn't just a panic of money. It's a panic of love, of stability, of childhood stolen too soon." In the end, the panic of 1907 was not defined by a single day's crash or a single man's rescue. It was defined by millions of moments, ordinary people navigating uncertainty, fear, and loss. The bankers would meet again. The laws would be rewritten. But these days, the days of empty pockets, of silent dinners, of borrowed coats and held hands, would live on in memory. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. The fires had been contained, the panic calmed, the lines outside the banks had thinned, trust companies no longer shuddered at dawn. The ticker tape ran smooth again. But while America returned to work, something deep beneath the surface had shifted. The air had changed. There were no parades, no banners, no grand pronouncements of victory, just a growing murmur. In cafes, in courtrooms, in Congress. Never again. Because the panic of 1907 was more than a market crash. It was a moment of national reckoning. A year when America, for all its power and industry, had to admit its financial system had no brain, no heart, and no spine. And it had taken one aging banker in one locked library to stop the country from collapsing into itself. That truth would echo from Wall Street to Washington, and it would spark something extraordinary: reform. In the early weeks of 1908, public pressure mounted. The people demanded answers. How had the system failed? Why had J.P. Morgan held more authority than the president during the crisis? Why did the fates of millions rest on decisions made behind closed doors? Congress, prodded by newspapers and labor unions alike, convened a formal investigation. The hearings that followed would come to be known as the Peugeot Committee, named after Louisiana Congressman Arsène Peugeot, a Democrat with a stern demeanor and a quiet fire in his voice. The committee's mission was clear: trace the sources of power in American finance. What they found shocked even the most jaded observers. The Peugeot Committee revealed what many suspected but few had documented. A small group of elite bankers, financiers, and trust company directors controlled a staggering portion of the nation's financial arteries. They held interlocking directorates, boards, where the same men sat on multiple companies, banks, and insurance firms. A web of connections, quiet, invisible, and nearly unbreakable. At the center of it, J.P. Morgan. The committee found that Morgan and his partners effectively controlled over 100 corporations, valued at more than $22 billion. A vast empire spanning steel, railroads, shipping, insurance, and banking. To some, he was a steward of order. To others, he was a monarch in all but name. Morgan himself was called to testify in December 1912, a spectacle so significant that people lined the streets outside the Capitol. He was older now, his hair grayer, his health fading. But when he entered the chamber, there was a hush. No cameras, no microphones, just the scrape of pens and the whisper of reporters. A congressman asked, "Is not commercial credit based primarily upon money or property?" Morgan replied slowly, his voice low, "No, sir. The first thing is character." The room fell silent. Before money or anything else, money cannot buy it, because a man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. It was a powerful moment. Sincere or strategic, the line became famous. But even as Morgan defended the ethics of his power, the existence of that power was no longer in question. Long before the Pujo hearings concluded, Senator Nelson Aldrich, a Republican from Rhode Island and a man long connected with banking interests, had begun working behind the scenes on a solution. In 1908, under his guidance, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which created the National Monetary Commission to study the financial systems of other countries and recommend reforms. The commission traveled across Europe to London, Berlin, Paris, studying how nations like Germany and Britain handled liquidity crises. Their conclusion? America needed a central bank, not a private titan, not an improvised response. A permanent, government-sanctioned, independently operated lender of last resort. In November 1910, a secretive meeting took place on Jekyll Island, Georgia, an exclusive retreat owned by millionaires. Those present included Nelson Aldrich, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Paul Warburg, a German-born banker and financial visionary, Henry P. Davison, Morgan's closest aide, Charles Norton of First National Bank. They arrived under false names, claiming to be on a duck-hunting trip. What they produced over 9 quiet days would become the basis for the most important financial reform in American history: the Federal Reserve System. Their plan envisioned a network of regional reserve banks, a central governing board, and a framework for managing credit and responding to panics. It would not be passed immediately, but the die had been cast. Before the Federal Reserve could be born, its accidental godfather would pass away. In March 1913, John Pierpont Morgan, the man who once held the nation's financial arteries in his palm, died in his sleep in Rome, Italy, at the age of 75. The news crossed the Atlantic in hours. Church bells tolled in New York. Flags were lowered. Newspapers ran black-bordered portraits. President Wilson reportedly said, "Morgan was a man too big to be owned." His funeral, held at St. George's Church, was attended by presidents, bishops, bankers, and the common people he rarely met, but whose lives he had touched. His personal fortune, though vast, was smaller than many expected. Because Morgan did not seek wealth for wealth's sake. He sought stability, order, legacy, and whether admired or feared, he had shaped the country forever. 9 months after Morgan's death, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The new system created 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, a Federal Reserve Board to oversee them, the authority to issue a national currency, the power to act as a lender of last resort. It was a monumental shift, the end of private panic response and the beginning of institutional intervention. For the first time, America had a tool to fight economic storms, not with the force of personality, but with the force of policy. The ghosts of 1907 were not forgotten. They had become blueprints. Today, the Federal Reserve is central to American life. It guides interest rates, manages inflation, responds to crises. Its decisions ripple through mortgages, car loans, business plans, and global trade. Few remember that it was born from a moment of collapse, that behind its sterile halls and cryptic minutes lies a story of fear, failure, and one man's desperate command in a darkening room. The panic of 1907 is rarely taught in schools. It left no monuments, no holidays, but it changed everything. It proved that markets, left to their own instincts, could destroy what they built. It showed that trust, that invisible bond between institutions and individuals, was the most fragile asset of all, and it demonstrated that sometimes the future of a nation hinges not on speeches or swords, but on the stillness of a library, the scratch of a pencil, and the voice of one man who refuses to blink. Narration fades, slow music, soft ambient light returning. In the end, we did not get perfection, but we got memory. And from that memory, we built something new. History doesn't repeat itself, they say, but it hums. It hums through printing presses and bank vaults, through hushed boardrooms and crowded unemployment lines. It hums through the silence before a crash and the breathless pause before a rescue. And in the quiet hum of modern finance, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of 1907. Because what happened in that uncertain autumn, when the markets shuddered and trust broke, wasn't just a moment frozen in time. It became a blueprint. 22 years after the panic of 1907, the stock market crashed again, this time on a scale so vast, so devastating, that it brought the world to its knees. The Great Depression. People remembered Morgan, the lone figure who had once locked the doors and saved the system. But in 1929, there was no Morgan. And even the Federal Reserve, still young, still learning, failed to respond with force. Banks failed by the thousands. Families lost homes, farms, futures. It wasn't just a crash. It was a fracture of faith. Roosevelt would rise. Reforms would follow. The FDIC, Social Security, SEC regulations, Glass-Steagall. America learned again that systems must be stronger than men. But still, the echoes persisted. In the late 20th century, the world experienced more tremors. The Black Monday crash of 1987 wiped trillions off global markets in a single day. A flash of panic with no clear cause. Computers had accelerated risk. There was no JP Morgan now, just algorithms and anxious headlines. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis began with a run on the Thai baht and spread like wildfire. Entire nations plunged into recession. In 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. Fortunes built on websites and speculation vanished overnight. Each time, central banks moved in. Liquidity was injected. Assurances made. But each time, the hum grew louder. A reminder that finance is not merely numbers. It's emotion, reaction, memory. And then came 2008. The collapse of Lehman Brothers. The freezing of credit markets. The implosion of AIG, Bear Stearns, and dozens of other financial institutions. It felt eerily familiar. Panic in the streets, but not loud, not chaotic, just a deafening digital silence as banks stopped lending. Consumers stopped spending, markets stopped trusting, And once again, a handful of men and women sat around long tables in Washington and New York, making decisions that would decide the fate of millions. There were no velvet curtains this time, no gas lamps, no Morgan. But there was Ben Bernanke, Henry Paulson, Tim Geithner, faces strained with sleeplessness, eyes scanning numbers that spelled collapse. Trillions were pumped into the system. Emergency laws passed. The Federal Reserve, born from Morgan's shadow, became the savior he once was. In the 21st century, the financial world is faster, larger, more interconnected than ever. Currency flows zip across oceans in nanoseconds. Cryptocurrencies rise and fall. Markets react to tweets, headlines, whispers. There is no longer one man to trust, no locked room to retreat to. Now, we have institutions, models, backstops. But the lesson of 1907 still remains, quiet and clear. Trust is fragile, panic is fast, and stability is a choice. We learned that regulation matters, that central banks must be ready, that transparency is not a luxury, it's a necessity. We learned that financial systems, no matter how advanced, are built on human decisions, human fears, human greed, and human hope. And we learned that sometimes the difference between collapse and recovery is a moment, a signature, a decision made in the dark. The library remains. Today, J.P. Morgan's private library still stands in New York City. Now a museum, quiet, ornate, lined with ancient manuscripts and golden spines. Tourists wander its halls. Children peer up at frescoed ceilings. Visitors trace their fingers along the polished wood of the long tables. Few know that once, in this very room, the future of a nation trembled and held. It is silent now, but if you close your eyes, you might still hear the whispers. The panic of 1907 did not end America, but it transformed it. It left behind no heroes carved in marble, no ticker tape celebrations, just a story of how close we came, of how one man, flawed, feared, and formidable, became a fulcrum, and of how, from the ashes, we chose not fear, but foundation.